Continuing with our study of the 1960s, today I'll be talking about the Warren Court, and that refers to the Supreme Court under the leadership of Chief Justice Earl Warren, who presided over the court from 1953 through 1969. Obviously, that was before the 1960s, although the bulk of the cases we'll talk about today took place during the 1960s, and that's when we study it now. So the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren is one of the most significant in American history. We can really compare it with the Marshall Court under Chief Justice John Marshall when Marbury versus Madison, that case that introduced judicial review, was utilized. So under Warren's court, the Supreme Court applies the Bill of Rights to the states and protects the rights of individuals accused of crimes, and that's many of the cases that we'll look at here. Also, the court used the power of the federal government to enforce civil rights legislation that was occurring in the 1960s. Now, Warren himself is considered an activist judge. He was considered fairly liberal and believed in a liberal interpretation of the Constitution, or if we go back in time, we would have referred to that as a loose interpretation or loose construction of the Constitution, as well as a more powerful role of the judicial branch in the United States government. He also recognized the constitutional right to privacy. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights that says an individual has the right to privacy, yet that liberal interpretation created this belief that Americans do have this right to privacy, and we'll see that in the Griswold versus Connecticut case, which struck down a Connecticut law making it illegal to disseminate or spread information about birth control. And in this particular Supreme Court case, the court struck down that Connecticut law, so it used its ability of judicial review in that way. This right to privacy will set the stage for the Roe versus Wade case that I'm sure you're all familiar with, which makes abortion legal in all 50 states, again, based on that right to privacy. So this ruling in Griswold versus Connecticut sets a precedent for later rulings. Now, one of the earliest cases, and one of the most significant in American history, that was during Earl Warren's tenure as Chief Justice, was Brown versus Board of Education, which we've talked about, obviously. And so we know that case and the implications of that case. So I'm not going to talk about that today. We're going to focus basically on the cases within the 1960s that expanded the rights of individuals, that had to do with interpreting the Constitution and the Bill of Rights specifically. First is Mapp versus Ohio. Now, the Mapp in this case is Dorlee Mapp. It was a woman whose home was being searched because it was believed that she was hiding a suspect in a bombing. Now, while the police were looking for that suspect, they found pornographic pictures tucked away in the home. And it was illegal to have pornography at this time, so they basically arrested Mrs. Mapp for that. But the problem was they weren't looking for that pornography. So the question was, should that be used against her? So in the case, in the ruling in the Supreme Court case, it provides protection against illegal searches, and that's based on the Fourth Amendment. So it states evidence obtained without a search warrant is not admissible in court. There was no warrant to search Dorlee's premises for that particular item, or those items, I should say. So it established something called an exclusionary rule. It prevents the government from using most evidence gained from an unreasonable search or seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment. So in court, any evidence that is obtained illegally without a warrant will be excluded from the case. It can't be used against the suspect in that case. All right, moving on to Baker versus Carr. This one wasn't so much dealing with suspects, but it was dealing with providing more representation for people. So in state legislatures, the seats were often apportioned based on geographic area as opposed to the amount of population. So this particular case is going to establish one person, one vote. So the representation will be based on population, not the geographic area. So what this means is that the shift of political power is from rural areas that had been overrepresented in state legislatures to urban areas which had previously been underrepresented, because there are more people living in these urban areas, that they are not getting the same level of representation as the rural areas. And so this Baker versus Carr case changes all of that, and it's to make sure that people are getting the appropriate representation. So one person equals one vote. Another case that deals with the interpretation of the Constitution specifically is Engel versus Vitale. So this case took place based on a school district in New York State, and in New York State there was a very generic prayer that was said at the beginning of each school day. It was non-denominational, meaning it was pretty much something that would apply to Catholics, Protestants, Jewish people even. So in this case, about 10 parents in this school district didn't want their children to have to say this prayer, and so they brought this case to the court. Now, the prayer was voluntary, but one of the things the court says is that even though it's voluntary, if a child doesn't say the prayer, that kind of draws them out and excludes them, and perhaps makes them the target of ridicule from other students. So anyway, in the case, the court ruled that reciting this prayer was in violation of the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment. So remember, the United States government cannot establish an official religion, and it's believed that in providing this prayer, the state of New York was establishing, this particular religious practice. This case, more than many others, proved very controversial. Still today, there are people who believe that students should be able to pray in schools. Eventually, it was used to eliminate any such prayers at public events, other public ceremonies that took place. So again, a pretty controversial ruling. Obviously, it doesn't affect students in parochial schools, just in the public schools. Two cases that do deal specifically with the rights of the accused would be Gideon versus Wainwright and Escobedo versus Illinois. So in the Gideon case, a man named Clarence Earl Gideon was charged with a robbery, essentially. And he was not provided with an attorney. This took place in the state of Florida. At the time, Florida only provided an attorney if you were in a case that dealt with, murder, or in some cases where the death penalty could possibly result. So the state would not provide him with an attorney. And the case was eventually taken to the Supreme Court. He did lose his original case. He appealed. In his case before the Supreme Court, they interpreted the 6th and 14th Amendment, stating that states must provide an attorney if a defendant cannot pay for their own. Previously, the way this was interpreted was that if a defendant could afford their own attorney, the states could not deny them that attorney. So in the cartoon that you see here, this is based on an earlier ruling, and the judge is saying free lawyers are only for rapists and murderers, other crimes aren't serious, and the defendant is saying, well, 8 years in prison seems serious to me. So it was really, what is a serious crime? Well, obviously, if you're spending a significant portion of your life in prison, if you're found guilty of the crime, that would certainly be considered serious. So this particular ruling means that all defendants will have the right to an attorney in any state in the union, regardless if they can pay for it or not, and that's the service that public defenders provide in the various states. In Escobedo versus Illinois, this was a murder charge. This particular defendant did not have their lawyer present at the time they were being questioned. Their lawyer was actually in the building. They were asking for their lawyer. They were not allowed to have their lawyer present because, assumedly that the police wanted to kind of coerce a confession out of the individual. So this is also based on interpretation of the 6th and the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment portion being, the due process clause, and that, proper procedures must be filed. The 6th Amendment portion that relates to both of these cases is that individuals have the right to an attorney present. Probably one of the most famous cases, if not the most famous during Warren's court, was Miranda versus Arizona. And you may have heard that term Miranda before. That is your Miranda rights. So when you're arrested, you are told of your Miranda rights, that you have the right to remain silent, and that you have the right to an attorney. And that's based on this case of Ernesto Miranda when he was arrested in Phoenix, Arizona for a rape and kidnapping. So in this particular ruling, the court is going to say that suspects must be informed of their rights before being questioned. Okay, so what you see on cop shows, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. That whole phrase that the police have to say when they arrest you, that is called Mirandizing you, or reading you your Miranda rights, and it's based on this particular case, which is based on the 5th Amendment, giving a suspect the right to refuse to be a witness against himself. So in other words, when you have the ability to plead the 5th, you will not answer any questions because you don't want to incriminate yourself. It's also based on the 6th Amendment, which guarantees criminal defendants the right to have an attorney present when they are being questioned. Now, the next case is Tinker versus Des Moines. That's the latest one we'll talk about, 1969. That's actually the last year that Earl Warren is Chief Justice. He will retire in 1969. And this protects something called symbolic speech. So this is really important because it's interpreting the First Amendment. But when we've talked about the First Amendment previously, we've talked about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the other freedoms protected by the First Amendment. But the question here is symbolic speech protected by the First Amendment? In other words, things that you may not actually vocalize, but you're communicating in another way. Now, there were a group of students at this school in Des Moines, Iowa, who were wearing black armbands to protest the war in Vietnam. They had been told by the school ahead of time not to do this, but the students wanted to kind of, go along with their convictions. They wanted to show their protest against the war, and they wore these black armbands. Two of the students involved were Mary Beth Tinker and her brother. So there's where the Tinker comes from. And I actually got to hear Mary Beth Tinker speak, which was really interesting. And she's very vocal today about protecting the rights of students and their First Amendment rights. In any event, the court ruled that wearing the black armbands was completely within their rights. It was covered and protected as symbolic speech by the First Amendment, and therefore the school district had no right to suspend the students, which they had done for wearing the armband. So that's the particular significance of that case, protecting First Amendment rights. So you can see in all of these different cases we've talked about, it really is all interpreting and protecting Bill of Rights protections. Okay, so sometimes these cases can be a bit confusing to us because sometimes the suspect is actually guilty, yet they will get off on a technicality, if the police aren't following the Constitution, if they're not reading Miranda rights and such. So such was the case with Miranda himself, actually. So in the cartoon here, you can see, actually Miranda was picked up for a robbery charge, but he had actually committed a rape previously, maybe a couple weeks before. And during the course of that, they're questioning about the robbery, he confessed to the rape of the young woman. So he signed a confession. He did so voluntarily, but during the course of the whole process, it was viewed that it was more of a coerced confession, even though he did do it voluntarily. He supposedly, he had dropped out of school after the 9th grade, or during the 9th grade. He was mentally unstable, and so it was really unclear if Miranda even really truly understood what his rights were. So he was found guilty of kidnapping and rape in that particular case, but the case eventually went to the Supreme Court because what they were trying to say was that the confession was, even though it was signed voluntarily, he did not have an attorney present when he was being questioned. He didn't know that he could remain silent. So this cartoon asks at the end there, how do we balance the rights of the accused with the ability of police to arrest criminals and bring them to justice? And I think that is a lingering question that we have here. We want to protect the rights of individuals, but we also want to make sure that justice is being done at the same time. So it really puts a burden on the police and the whole criminal justice system to make sure that they are protecting the rights of people while they are getting together the evidence or perhaps even the confessions that they need to convict someone. You'll be glad to know, knowing that Miranda did actually commit this crime, that prosecutors were later able to retry the case. They had some other evidence that they were able to gather other than Miranda's actual confession, and he was convicted, and he served 11 years in prison for that particular crime. And he went on to be killed in a bar fight a couple years after he got out of prison. So he wasn't necessarily